Hello everybody, welcome back to JayEmm Friends, particularly if you have just watched part 1. Thanks for sticking with it. Here is part 2 of a little sit down and chat about my journey getting back into the wonderful and wacky world of two wheels. So for those who've not been following the journey so far, a super brief recap. Way back when, I rode motorbikes a lot. You may not realise this because over the last few years I haven't really talked about it that much, but I actually got my bike licence before my car licence in October 2006. I then rode a moped, I got my full bike licence, I then had a scooter, a Gilera Runner VXR 200. I was then very lucky because my dad, who was big into bikes, decided he wanted to get out of the sort of modern road bike thing, which he felt was getting a little bit too crazy and fast at the time, and get back into the bikes of his youth, chiefly 1970s Japanese two-strokes. And conveniently for me, those were all within the 33, I think it was, horsepower that I was restricted to on account of the fact that back then you had a 2-year probationary period after you got your license before you could ride a full power bike. Today, it's a lot more complicated unless you do direct access, and I talked about that in the previous video. So I rode stuff like a Suzuki GT250 Ram Air, a Kawasaki S1C, that has to be one of my favourites, had a brief go on a Benelli 254, then later I did get to ride other stuff as my probationary period expired, so I had to go on a Kawasaki KH400, loved that, then more modern stuff too, a Suzuki GSR 600, the modern iteration of the Triumph Bonneville, did a Honda VFR 800, Suzuki Gixxer Thao on track. I did some classic race bikes, 1980s Kawasaki ZXR 600. I did a ZXR 750, like a 1992, like old world superbike type thing. I got to ride quite a bit. I was very, very fortunate. I did all sorts of stuff with the bikes, did track days, did Euro tours, all these sorts of things. And then life got in the way. I went to university, didn't get to see the family quite as often, didn't have the time that I once did, and then when YouTube started, well, I had neither the time nor the money for doing all these bikey things. So about 6 years ago, I kind of stopped. Not through a sort of active decision, but it just became something I no longer had the time for. And of course, definitely didn't have the money to buy my own bike either. So that really, as far as I was concerned, might have been the end of my biking career. But there was one thing parked in the corner of my garage that was constantly reminding me of what had been and what could be. And that was my grandfather's old Triton. Now that is a bike that is a combination of a Norton chassis, a slimline featherbed Dominator, and a Triumph Tiger engine in that specific case. And this was a very popular thing to do back in the day because it was considered that Norton had the best chassis and Triumph had the best engine, and the engineering was so simple that you could easily combine the two. So that was the bike that Grandad had. He rode it as a teenager. He's had it from at least 1967, but unfortunately was killed himself in a motorbike accident in 1999, and the bike was parked up in Nan's garage. I eventually took it, moved it into mine, and always intended to get it running because we knew it hadn't run for, well, quite some time. In fact, it had been off the road since 1995, so before even he passed away, it hadn't been running. And I wanted to get it going again, just to see it, you know, live once again. It was a real important thing to me. I didn't have the money to do that up until recently when I thought, you know what, I got to get this done. I met the guy who I trusted to do it, a lovely chap called Simon from the Hangar Motorcycle Company. He's done a fantastic job. The bike has been restored, but as ever the case with these things, this is a bike that's been off the road for 30 years. There were a few bits that needed doing. And I suppose as this video is going to be talking about my journey of rediscovery, I should talk about my first bike ride in about 6 years, which was on Grandad's bike. Now, I had plans to film this for the channel, but I figured, you know what, there's going to be so much going on and there's so much potential for it to just be a non-event, I'll not bother filming it. Well, probably just as well. So, Grandad's bike, I got it running and it starts pretty easily, actually. It's a very, very nice thing. Simon has done a fantastic job with the engine. It's really cute, really smooth. But I tried to get it going. I tried to get it out of the garage, and it just didn't want to go. Just did not want to go at all. Felt like I was trying to go into second. It was just awful. It was not happy. I got about 30 yards down the road. It started rattling. I noticed that the wheel looked like it was warped. Like, oh, it all went really, really wrong. Really, really quickly. I tried to turn it around at the bottom of the road. I just couldn't get it started again. When I did get it started, I couldn't get it into gear again. I kept stalling it. I took about 20 minutes, I think, to do all of probably 400 yards. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. And I felt really, really bad. Not really angry or annoyed at Simon or anything like that, but more myself. So it turns out that a couple of things were going wrong. It felt like I was going into second because I was. Now, this is an old Triumph engine with pre-unit construction. So on a modern bike, your engine and gearbox are all sort of, one big casing. But on old bikes, they're not. You've got an engine and a gearbox separate as you would with a car. Now, one of the quirks of Grandad's bike is that the gear lever is not on the left, it's on the right. And I'd always been told that not only is it on the right, it also goes the wrong way round. So on a modern bike, you click down for first, neutral's kind of halfway up, then second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. On Grandad's bike, it was over here, and I was told it's up for first, and then same thing back down. There's only 4 gears anyway. But it turns out this is not true. The reason it felt like I was going into second is because I was. Now, if it were a BSA, another old British bike, this would have been the correct way to go for first. But on the Triumph, no, it's the direction that I expect, just the wrong side. So that's one thing. The clutch apparently did need a little bit of adjustment. Simon has now done that, and apparently it was a little bit funky and difficult. And of course, because I was holding it in for absolutely ages, it was getting a bit frustrating, and that shouldn't have been the case if I was doing my job correctly. This also explains why I couldn't find neutral, because what I was actually going for, I think, was third. So yeah, it was a bit of a disaster because of a simple misunderstanding. The tyre issue, now, I'd actually said to him before that we thought one of the wheels was buckled. Dad told me that maybe it was back in the day, but he checked and they were okay, and it turns out it's just where the tyre itself wasn't just seated quite perfectly. So it was really a fairly minor thing, and when you're on the bike, you notice it. That got sorted. And the horrendous rattle, one of the screws for the number plate had worked its way loose. Simple as that. So it's just some really small, minor stuff that I'd expect with any big recommission rebuild of a bike. It's just one of these things. Anyway, it's coming back tomorrow, and I will have another ride on my own just to make sure it goes okay. And then if that goes well, I'll bring you along for the next one, because I'm sure you'd all like to see it. Anyway, that was the first ride, and it didn't go well. And this left me sort of worried and thinking, oh my, have I made an awful, awful mistake? Is getting back onto a bike just going to be a bad idea, full stop? Now, the fact is that Grandad's bike really is way older than anything I'd ever ridden. The oldest I'd ever taken out before was a 1970s bike, and Grandad's bike really was technologically a 1950s bike. I know 50s and 70s cars are very different, so I expect with bikes it's much the same. So I figured, you know what? I got to get back on the horse. I got to get out there, I got to get on a bike, and I got to prove to myself, as much as anybody else, that I can still do this. This is, really important to me. Now, up in Scotland a little while ago, I'd had a morning off, and so I'd gone to visit a few motorbike dealerships in Glasgow. The first one I went to was Ducati, because of all the bike brands that I got to ride when I was younger, I never got to try a Ducati. And a Ducati is an iconic thing. If you are humouring me and you're watching this not knowing anything about bikes, Ducati is kind of like, I don't want to maybe say like the Ferrari of bikes, because that's probably more MV Agusta, but it's like, it's an Italian brand. It's like an Alfa Romeo or a Maserati or something. They're quirky, they're interesting, they're cool. They do stuff their own way. They've got a really successful and very proud sporting pedigree. They're cool bikes. You love a Ducati, you hate a Ducati. They're infamous for their awkward, awful riding positions, but also being, when you're in the mood and they're in the mood, a brilliant bike too. And I never got to ride one, ever. So anyway, when I was up in Glasgow, went past a Ducati dealership, thought, right, got to go in there, have a look at what's what, because I've been out of the saddle for so long, I don't really even understand the range anymore. But what I want to do is I want to buy, over time, a number of bikes, just a small collection, maybe half a dozen or so, but hey, it's me, right? I'm probably going to go crazy. But I want them all to be iconic interesting bikes. They don't have to be rare, they don't have to be special. Stuff I'm looking at is often like 1,500 quid, 2 grand. Yeah, not expensive, crazy bikes. But they've got to represent what I expect from the brand. So for a Ducati, to me, it's got to be a twin, a V-twin, or an L-twin, as they call it. It's also got to have a trellis frame, that iconic Ducati look. And preferably it has to have a clutch that sounds like a bag of spanners. Old Ducatis have a dry clutch as opposed to a wet clutch like many bikes, and so they do sound, well, like a bag of spanners being chucked around. And the bike I really wanted as a kid was a 749. The 999 is basically the same thing, but the 749 is the baby brother, and the 749 I think is a really cool looking bike. When it came out, people didn't think that way, because the older bikes, the 748 and the 998, 996 and 916, those were considered the prettiest bike ever made. They were the best thing. Foggy won championships on the 916, so people loved those. And when the 999 came out, people went, ugh, it's horrid. Unfortunately, in the last few years, people have started to realise that the 999 and 749 are also cool looking bikes and very good things in their own right, so prices have gone back up. But I always fancied a 749, and you can get one from about a few £1,000s. I also really, really wanted an MV Agusta. I mean, if you'd asked, 15-year-old James, what are the best bikes in the world, it'd be a Ducati 999 or an MV Agusta F4 CC. They're still about 50 grand, so I'm not going to be buying one of those. But a regular MV Agusta F4 of the time with the classic red and silver paintwork, they're attainable. They're sort of 10 grand or so. Now, I've not ridden an MV Agusta of any description yet, but a quick visit to the Ducati showroom did tell me a few things. First of which was that though I probably will have a sports bike at some point, they are still awkward things to get on. Even the more modern ones, the Panigale, it's a really, really uncomfortable, hunched over riding position. I have been blessed, or cursed, depending on how you see it, with a long torso. Viewers of the channel will know this, but with a long torso comes short legs. And on a bike, the torso is not really a big issue, but the legs are. And sports bikes tend to have very high seats. Remember this, it's going to be important later on, okay? And it's just not comfy. It's just not natural, it's just not nice. So I sat on a bunch of other things in the Ducati showroom, and the one sort of bike that I know I don't want is a retro-styled one. Because as far as I'm concerned, I've already got a genuine retro-styled bike. I don't need one that's pretending to be old. So I thought, well, the sensible thing to look at would be a Ducati Monster. I love naked bikes, unfaired ones where you sort of sit more upright, they're more relaxed, they're more comfortable. They've still got, in many cases, the performance, and the Monster is an iconic bike. They've sold like 300,000 of them. It basically saved Ducati, and it's evolved quite a bit. The modern Monster, unfortunately, has ditched the trellis frame. However, wind the clock back a few years to about sort of 2018, and you got the last of the old school looking Monsters that had a new liquid cooled engine with 150 odd horsepower, and they're still a very fine looking machine. But more than that, they've got your ABS, your traction control, your modern screen, all that sort of stuff that modern bikes come with. And as I mentioned in sort of part one, those things appeal to me. As someone getting back into biking, I feel like, you know what, having a few rider aids and that sort of stuff, particularly if I'm buying a powerful bike, I'd appreciate those. So I sat on the Monster. It was a 1200S, and I quite liked it. Didn't have any time to test ride, didn't have any gear with me either at the time, but I did then go round to Triumph in Glasgow, who are lovely people too. Sat on a Street Triple 765, already having the Triton. I thought a modern Triumph to go next to it could look quite good, and the 765 sort of felt quite good, and I know it's a bike that a lot of people like. I then went round to Harley Davidson, had a look at quite a few things, and though I've never really sort of felt like a Harley is me, I've still yet to ride one, and this is something one day I need to fix. Anyway, so I made a mental note of these things, got home, had my disastrous ride on the Triton, and then said, okay, let's book in, let's get back on the horse and get out for a test ride. So, first test ride was a Ducati Monster 1200 over at Cambridge. This, barring the horrible incident with the Triton, was the first time I got back on a bike in about 6 years. It's a 1200, makes 150 horsepower, doesn't weigh all that much, it's sub 200 kilos, it's a quick bike, really. By any normal person's standards, they're fast. And I was concerned about this, because it's a big, torquey twin, it's got a lot of go. Yes, it's got rider aids, but you shouldn't really go out expecting to use them. The conditions were good, but I was nervous. you know, I was a bit nervous about it. Within about 100 yards, it all came back to me. It was fantastic. The bike was comfortable. The brakes were quite grabby, I will say that, but the seat was nice. The riding position was fairly good. On the Monster, you don't see really any of the bike. You're kind of far forward, so you just got the world. And it was fantastic. It was just sensational. Within a mile, I was going, yeah, I need a bike again. This is just brilliant. I just loved every moment of it. I wasn't going quick. I put my foot down, gave it a twist to the wrist, enjoyed the speed, and it's a quick bike. It's a really quick bike, but not intimidating. One of the good things about bikes is that by and large they're all still naturally aspirated, unlike the car world where they've moved to turbocharging. This means that even stuff with big power figures is not that daunting, because you'll only get the peak power figure if you ask for it. Although I feel like a bit of a hypocrite, because I'm now going to tell you that I like twins because they actually have more of their performance accessible at lower RPM, and I feel like maybe that's a better thing to have, because if you're in slightly the wrong gear or whatever on a twin, it doesn't seem to matter as much. They've got that grunt low down to sort of, save you from embarrassing yourself. Anyway, that went really, really well. And they had a 1200, they had a slightly older 1200S, and they're both available at, I think, just over $8,000. They were just under 9, and they've discounted them recently. So they're a strong contender. I haven't bought anything yet, by the way. So that was great. Loved that. Next up, I wanted to try another bike, which initially I thought I hadn't ridden before, but then I remembered I had, which was a BMW. Now, you say BMW bike to most people, and they're going to think long way round or long way down, Ewan McGregor, Charlie Borman, adventure bike. I've never really considered an adventure bike because they're for adventures, and I don't do adventures. I don't do off-roading, and I don't do anymore big long road trips. But I had sat on a Tiger at Triumph in Glasgow and sort of gone, yeah, I kind of get this. And I figure, a bit of comfort in my old age is not a bad thing. So I went to BMW, and they were trying to put me out on a 4-cylinder naked bike, because I'd said I want a naked bike. And I thought, they're interesting. And they had an S1000R, which is a cool bike, and one I'd always sort of lusted after, because I remember the S1000RR coming out when I was still into bikes a while ago. And this looked interesting, similar power to the Ducati, but 4 cylinders, but it's a BMW, and I like BMW cars, and a BMW bike would be a nice thing. So I said, would it be possible to get a ride on one of those? And they said, well, actually, no, we don't have one of those as a demonstrator. But why don't we send you out on the M1000R, which has the full fat engine from the S1000. So it's nearly 210 horsepower. And they said, oh, and we'll also send you out on a GS. Because, BMW, iconic GS, and to me, again, like for a Ducati, it's got to have a trellis frame and a twin. A BMW, to me, has to have the cylinder heads poking out the side, preferably air-cooled ones. Now, I thought, right, okay, that's fine. The GS is a very tall bike. I sat on one, and it was a little bit uncomfortable. Then I sat on one that was a low one, and that was much better. So I booked in a test ride, came back, and I thought, right, let's take the GS out first, because that's going to be the easy one, and the M1000 is going to be the tricky so-and-so. Unfortunately, the demonstrator that they had of the GS was not a low one. It was a tall one. I took it out. First 10 minutes, brilliant. Loved it. So comfortable. Really enjoyed the riding position. It felt like you're on a horse that knows how to behave itself. It was sensational. Engine, punchy, powerful, plenty torquey. Again, it's a nice modern liquid-cooled one, so it's still got that sort of familiar thrum to it, but it's got lots and lots of go. Felt really not dramatically slower than the Monster, and I really enjoyed it. It was very chuckable, very nice. And I sort of thought, what, I'm kind of getting the adventure bike thing. I thought, actually I could have one of these, even just for short blasts. It's a nice thing to be on. And I like the fact you could see more, and you could be seen, and all that stuff. Then I dropped it. First time in my entire life that I've ever dropped a motorbike. I was coming through a village, got to the end of it, and there's a big, big wide mouth gets you out onto the main road, and you could go left or right, and I decided to go right. And I came up, and as you do, I clicked through into a neutral, and I went to lean on my right side, and I just went, and if you've been on a bike, you'll have probably experienced this, but basically with a bike, and bearing in mind the GS weighs 1/4 of a ton, it's not a light bike. There comes a point where the bike is leant so far over that when you're on it, you're not going to be able to save it. Now, a smaller, lighter bike, this isn't a problem, or a lower bike, this isn't a problem. But when you get to the point where my left leg is no longer on the floor, the road itself is kind of canted over like that, and the bike is over like that, and I'm holding it. It's not hit the ground, but I also know there's no way I'm going to be able to get it upright without going whee and then smashing it to pieces. So at that point, my only opportunity was to just put it down as slowly as I could, dying inside the entire time and thinking, oh, first test ride on this bike and I've dropped it. Never in my life, and this has happened now. I just want the ground to swallow me up. And my confidence took a knock again, and I felt really bad about this. So I took it back to BMW, explained to them what had happened. They were very thankful and said, you've been really honest about it. And anyway, it cost me 200 odd quid for a new crash bar, but the crash bar did its job, and that is going to be a souvenir that's going to go on my wall of shame at some point soon, alongside a few other pieces of memorabilia from over the years. This then left me very nervous about the M1000. I mean, I thought they might have said, just don't go out on the M1000. You damaged one of our bikes already. But they were very happy to send me out on it. And I'd not even asked for an M1000. I was never going to buy an M1000. But they sent me out on it. And here I am on a bike which weighs under 200 kilos, I think, has over 200 horsepower. This is nutty power to weight ratio stuff. I mean, that's the equivalent of like my S2000 having 1200 horsepower. This is a lot. But I kind of liked it. It was nice. It was smooth. It was easy to ride. It wasn't terrifying at all. Again, because it's got all its power like way up there, like 14,000 RPM, it was predictable. If you don't want that amount of power, you don't have to have it. It had a quick shifter too, which was one of my first times riding a bike with one, and it was nice, easy to use, very, very smooth. I liked it. The bike also, just because it was so much smaller and more compact than the GS, was great. I mean, it has wings on it. It's a bike with wings on, because it needs the aerodynamics to keep it on the ground. And I did go to the full 14,000 RPM, and it is quick as heck. But I want one in black, and to have it in black, you need to specify the competition pack. And then it's a 25,000 plus pounds motorcycle, which is again a lot. And I'm no way qualified to ride a bike like that. So, they were interesting. GS was a definite possibility, but expensive. The one I rode, I think, was about 18 grand or so. And new 1250s are no longer available anyway, and they're a lot of money. So it's a possibility. And I'd like a GS one day, but I'll probably buy an older one, I think, a 1200 or so. Anyhow, so the search continued, and the next thing I wanted to try was the Triumph Street Triple, because I figured this could be actually a pretty good bet. So I went to Triumph over in Essex and took out the 765 RS, which is a slightly sporty variant, but importantly, it's available in yellow, which the regular one is not. In fact, one of the things that's really frustrated me about buying a bike is that you don't have anywhere near the amount of options as you do with a car. The bikes themselves tend to come in like 1, 2 or 3 colours, if you're lucky. That's about it. And then all the options, as it were, are dealer fit accessories. So I'm a little bit surprised that more manufacturers haven't got like a custom department, because when you think about it, a lot of these bikes, there's not really much to paint. And if they just said, yeah, we can paint it any colour you want, but it's another 2 grand, like I'd probably do it just to have a bike in a wacky colour scheme, but they won't. So that's a shame. Anyway, I rode the 765 on some roads that I do know fairly well, and it was a nice bike, but I did start to think, actually, it's not quite got that low-down grunt that I've just gotten used to with the GS and the Monster and all that. And, it makes a lovely sound. The quick shifter wasn't quite as good as the other bikes that I'd ridden. It was maybe a little too firm for me as well, but then you could get the R, but then you can't get the R in yellow. You see, this is my problem. I want the tarty stuff. I want the nice suspension and everything, but I don't want it ultra race-focused, ultra stiff. One of the big differences between the car and bike world that I've noticed is that bikes are so much more focused on track. Really properly track-focused cars, of course, they exist, but they're just not as common. Whereas bikes, yeah, every top model, they're like, yes, track. So I rode that, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. I just didn't. It was really nice, and the people at Triumph were lovely and everything, but it just didn't light my fire. So I then booked another appointment at a brand I hadn't really even considered at all, but did thanks to a friend of mine called Chris, and that's KTM. Now, Chris had taken me to the KTM dealer when I bought my Maserati, and we were driving back through near to where he lives, and he said, look, we should look at this KTM shop. We turned up on an open day, and people and bikes everywhere, and we had a quick look at a few things that they had, and we said, look, we should come back when you're a little bit less busy, because actually, kind of interested in these bikes. They do them in a sexy blue, and I'll admit I'm a tart, you know this if you know the channel, and you know, I saw these bikes and thought, yeah, they look kind of cool. They look wacky. They're like some crazy, you know, bugs from space. But they're interesting, and I'd never considered a KTM. Now, the KTM shocked me, I think, more than any other bike that I rode, because I took out two bikes, the 890 Duke GP and the Super Duke R1290 Evo. Now the 1290 I'd not really even considered, because it's a seriously powerful bike, 180 horsepower, 140 newton meters of torque, which is over 100 pound-foot. It's got a lot of grunt. It's also very light. It's under 200 kilos again. So in the real world, it's probably quicker than the BMW that I'd rode. It's an expensive bike as well. They're £18,000 list price. It's got technology up the wazoo. And if you read the KTM website, I mean, personally, I think actually they're doing themselves in, because the KTM website is just full of the most incredible hyperbole. You know, everything you read is like, this bike's a beast, it's an animal, it's angry, it hates you and your family. They'll tell you it's the sort of bike where you'll open the garage door and you'll find that it's been reading top shelf literature and smoking cigarettes while you've been away and drinking your booze. It's incredible. I mean, they make this bike sound horrible. The other thing is that when I'd sat on it in the showroom, I was already perched sort of quite high. And after the GS incident, I became fascinated with seat heights. And though the 1290 is a little bit lower than the GS, not by much, about 15 mil. So I actually messaged KTM to cancel the ride of the 1290. I said, look, I'll just take the 890 out, it's all I need. But they said, well, look, actually, the Evo version that you're looking at riding, that we're going to send you out on, has semi-active suspension, which is another thing that bikes have gained over the last few years, and it can lower itself, so it'll sit a little bit lower than usual. So I thought, okay, if you guys are confident, and I was very honest about what had happened, they said, no, take it out, try it, we think you'll be okay. So I turned up thinking, look, the 1290 is going to be such a lunatic mobile, I'll ride it for about 5 minutes, scare myself senseless, take it back, and maybe the 890 could be a little bit more sort of what I think, or what I'm after. So, when I get there, I wanted to take the 890 out first, but the 890 didn't have fuel in it, so they sent me out on the 1290 first. And the 1290 is one of the biggest shocks I think I've ever had, because for all of KTM's literature about how angry and evil and the spawn of Satan that it is, it was lovely to ride. It was a pussycat. Now, I've watched a lot of reviews since, and it turns out that maybe if I'd ridden the Super Duke about 5-6 years ago, it would have been an animal and difficult and horrible and everything else. But now, in its third generation, a few years in with its active suspension and all this stuff, it was lovely. It was smooth. There was a lot of power. I mean, a lot. It's seriously fast, but it was controllable. It only gave you as much as you wanted. And once the suspension had settled and done its thing, I could put my feet flat on the floor. It was fantastic. Didn't feel daunting or intimidating whatsoever. More than that, it also has, in between the headlights, this sort of really distinctive looking bug-eye thing, you've got an intake. So you can hear it pulling the air in. Sounds really cool. Okay, that's not maybe the best impression. I'm not selling it to you here, I expect. But it was interesting. It was different. I liked it. It was really nice. And actually, at that point, I thought, do I even need to really ride the 890? Because now I kind of like the 1290. But, you know, they put fuel in it. They've made the time. I should take the 890 out. And the 890, and if you're watching this and, you know, you're thinking about buying a bike for yourself, you know, either starting biking or you're getting back into biking, I think the KTM 890 Duke GP, I haven't ridden the R, I rode the GP, it's probably the best, most balanced motorbike I've ever ridden. It's fantastic. Plenty of power, although after the 1290 I did sort of take it from road to sport mode just to give it a bit more sensitivity on the throttle. It's nice brakes, really progressive, really smooth. This is one difference between the GP and the R. The R has more aggressive brakes that'll be a little bit sharper, but the GPs really were just fine for me. But the most amazing thing, this is a bike that weighs 166 kilos dry, so a few more wet, but it felt like I was back on a 125. It was incredible. It's so light, so nimble. You just sort of move around with it. You play around like you're on a bicycle. It was amazing. It was so friendly, so approachable. Even made a pretty decent noise. I'll be honest, I kind of written it off because it's a parallel twin and I just want a V. I want a V rather than a parallel twin. I don't know, in my head I've just never been a fan of parallel twins, but V twins are somehow cooler. But this was a nice bike. It's smaller as well, and other than the seat, which was just rock hard, inexplicably so, because the 1290 seat was actually quite nice and comfortable by comparison, but this was just not. But ignoring that, was fabulous. The only problem is I'd ridden the 1290, and the 890 was just so balanced, so smooth, so linear, so predictable, so everything. It was just really, really good. But the 1290 has that kind of edge of madness. It also doesn't help that at the moment they're doing some quite aggressive promotions on the 1290s, so they're knocking £3,000 off of those, but £1,000 off of the 890, and this has given me something of a dilemma. They're also giving the best warranty of all the bikes I've looked at the minute, so most others are sort of 2, maybe 3 years, KTM 4 years. Apparently the brand has a reputation for not being the most reliable, which, look, you know the cars I own, and I've got a warranty that'll be sorted. So, but a 4-year warranty, that's pretty darn good. The other thing I like about the 1290 is it's got that kind of classic trellis frame and a lot of it, and that's camera mounting points. So the 1290 is a definite consideration. After that, I've ridden 2 other bikes, which were the Yamaha MT-09, which is essentially their equivalent of the Triumph Street Triple. I remember when the original MT-01, I think it was, came out years ago when I was, you know, still quite young, and that was a funky bike. I liked that. A lot of people didn't like it, I think, because it just didn't have enough power for a lot of people, but to me then, the 40, 50 horsepower, whatever it was quite a bit. You know, that was more than enough for me. The MT-09's got a lot more. It's like 120 or something, and it's a triple. I decided a while ago that, you know, the 4s are nice, but I want something different. I want a 2 or a 3. That's, I think, going to appeal to me. I rode the MT-09. It was a bit of a disappointment. It was very, very firm. And then, at the same dealership, Motor Technics in Stowmarket, I rode a Moto Guzzi Mandello V100. And that was a really cool bike. Unlike all of the other stuff I'd looked at, this was a sports tourer. The other stuff was more sort of sports naked kind of bikes, but this is a sports tourer. So it's bigger, it's heavier, it's like 220, 230 kilos. So other than, say, the GS, it's by far the biggest, bulkiest bike. But it didn't feel as daunting or as big as the GS. It's certainly a lot lower, easier to get on. And in S-Guise, they do it in a lovely green paint with some, you know, gold or bronzy coloured toppers for the cylinders, and it's got the classic Moto Guzzi. It's a V, but it's sideways compared to a Ducati, so you get the head sticking out the side of the bike. You start it up, it rocks a little bit, has little wings that come out that apparently sort of, you know, lower the air pressure going over you. It's got an electronically adjustable screen. You can move up and down. The top version's got active suspension as well, like the KTM that I'd ridden. Oh, that was the other thing about the KTM. I mean, it's just the 1290 was comfortable. Like, not crazy comfy, not the comfiest bike. The 890 I think was a bit softer, but just for a bike that I thought was going to be wild, so nice. Anyway, this Moto Guzzi, I took it out and I was like, yeah, this is nice. This is really nice. And I want something that's a little bit different, and the Guzzi is definitely different. But it also felt like a bike that you weren't really making compromises for. You know, I expected it to be like, yeah, it's a kind of nice bike, but also it's not got any of the stuff that the other bikes do. But it does. It has all the traction control, rider aids, ABS, all that sort of stuff. And it was lovely. Really, really nice. And they do it in green with gold and a brown leather seat. So that's nice. So I'm still working out what it is that I want to buy. I don't really have a set budget, but I do want something that's a little bit interesting, a little bit different. That's why, barring the Yamaha that I rode kind of because it was there, I've not really looked at anything Japanese, because I've ridden loads of Japanese bikes, and I like Japanese bikes, and they're perfectly good bikes. I'm sure they're brilliant bikes, but they just don't excite me. They don't wow me. They don't have that sort of zing, I suppose. I want something a little bit more different, a little bit more offbeat. And yeah, so that's been my experience thus far. It's been some ups, some downs, and some ups again. And I'm thinking maybe of riding an Indian next, an FTR 1200. And I still probably should try an MV Agusta as well. I mean, I've just loved getting back to bikes, getting back to bike showrooms, talking to all the people and just, you know, rediscovering this whole world. So if you're watching and you've been through the same process, I'd love to hear what it was that you came up with. And if you maybe own one of the bikes that I've talked about and you like it, don't like it, whatever, please tell me. And as ever, if you've enjoyed this content, please encourage me to make more by commenting down below, hitting the like and the subscribe buttons, and I'll see you for the next one, by which time I might have a bike. Who knows? Or you may see me riding one. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.